Justice unveiled. The trial that shook America. In just 7 minutes, Justice Amy Coney Barrett accused Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett of treason, threatening her with prison before a packed courtroom. But what no one expected was Jasmine's response, a single letter written by a grieving black mother that would bring 12 jurors to tears, silence the room, and shock 22 million Americans watching from home. What secret was powerful enough to take down one of America's most respected judges and transform a standard trial into a national reckoning for justice? It all began on a stormy Tuesday morning when Jasmine Crockett stepped into courtroom 3B, unaware that within the hour, she'd expose a truth that would echo across the nation. The atmosphere outside the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Dozens of reporters lined the marble corridor, their cameras trained on the heavy oak doors as if they might burst open with history at any second. Spectators murmured in low tones while political operatives paced with phones pressed to their ears, trading rumors like currency. Word had spread like wildfire the night before. Justice Amy Coney Barrett would be presiding over a sudden inquiry against Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. No one knew the full details, but everyone knew it would be public, televised, and potentially career-ending. When Jasmine finally appeared at the far end of the hallway, the noise dimmed to a ripple of gasps and whispered commentary. She wasn't surrounded by aides or security detail, just walking with quiet determination in a simple navy blue suit, her hair pinned in a neat twist, her heels echoing confidently across the stone floor. Some snickered, perhaps expecting a tearful breakdown or desperate denial. But Jasmine didn't flinch. Her gaze remained fixed ahead as if the doors before her held something deeper than danger. She nodded once at the bailiff and entered the courtroom with the calmness of someone who had already seen the worst the system could do. Inside, the gallery was packed. Reporters jockeyed for position. A few senators leaned forward in their seats. Even former President Donald Trump sat in the back row, arms folded, eyes narrowed. Whispers trailed Jasmine as she moved toward the defense table, but she offered no greetings, no glances. She simply placed her worn leather briefcase on the table and sat down. Her expression was unreadable, but behind those eyes, something stayed, not fear, not defiance, something quieter, something far more dangerous. The silence snapped like a twig as Justice Barrett entered the courtroom. Her black robe billowed slightly as she ascended to the bench. Her face, usually a portrait of polished calm, looked tense, drawn in a way that suggested something personal was about to unfold. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. There was no procedural warm-up, no listing of charges from a clerk. Instead, Barrett's voice rang out, cold and sharp. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, this court is in possession of evidence that you willfully withheld classified military files related to Operation Hollow River. You are hereby ordered to respond under oath. A stunned hush fell over the room. Then a soft ripple of laughter emerged from a few members of the press corps, from the smug legal observers in the gallery, from the political figures who had never quite accepted a black woman from Texas rising to national prominence. Jasmine didn't look at them. She didn't blink. She simply exhaled once and stood slowly, her hands resting calmly on the table in front of her. Justice Barrett's gaze narrowed, trying to read Jasmine's expression, but there was nothing to read, no anger, no panic, just stillness. Someone in the back let out a short, mocking chuckle. Another added, "It's over." The courtroom had turned in mere moments into a spectacle. Cameras flashed. People whispered words like arrest, treason, and expulsion. It felt orchestrated, like Barrett had waited for the perfect stage and the perfect audience to publicly humiliate Jasmine Crockett. This wasn't just about documents. This was political theater with one goal, to destroy her legacy. But then everything began to shift. Jasmine's eyes lifted slowly to meet Barrett's. Her posture was no longer just calm. It was unshakable. And when she finally spoke, her voice didn't tremble. It didn't rise in protest. It didn't plead for explanation. Instead, she said just 6 words, evenly, softly. "Are you sure you won this?" The courtroom froze again, but this time it wasn't out of shock. It was confusion. Barrett faltered slightly, lips parting, unsure how to respond. Jasmine leaned forward, her eyes darker now, deeper. "Because once I begin," she added, "nothing about this country will look the same again." The air turned electric. Every head in the courtroom tilted toward her. The reporters stopped typing. The laughter vanished, and in that razor-sharp silence, something far more powerful than fear settled over the room: curiosity. What did Jasmine know? What was she about to say? And more importantly, why did Justice Barrett, America's most feared judge, suddenly look like she wanted to call for a recess? No one knew it yet, but what Jasmine was about to reveal wouldn't just change the course of this trial. It would ignite a reckoning that would ripple through the military, the justice system, and the highest halls of government. For the first time that morning, the people watching from across the country stopped waiting for conviction because deep down they sensed something greater was coming: the truth. Jasmine stood still for a moment longer, her hand resting gently on the leather briefcase that had sat quietly beside her since the beginning of the hearing. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she slowly opened the flap and reached inside, not for a document, not for a legal defense, but for something smaller, something older. Her fingers found it easily, as if she had rehearsed this motion 100 times in silence. And when she pulled it out, the room seemed to hold its breath. It was a letter, creased at the corners, yellowed at the folds, and slightly torn along the edges. The kind of letter that had been opened and closed too many times, held too tightly by someone whose grief was heavier than words. Jasmine unfolded it carefully, treating it more like a relic than a piece of evidence. For a long second, she simply stared at it. Then, with her voice low and trembling just enough to be human, she began to read aloud. "My name is Lena Watkins, and my son Elijah never came home. They told me it was an accident. They told me it was protocol. They told me not to ask questions." A quiet sob broke the stillness from somewhere in the gallery. Jasmine paused just for a second, then continued. "But mothers know," she read, her voice cracking slightly. "I knew the moment I saw that Polish flag folded in their hands that something was wrong. I knew they were lying, and I prayed every single day that someone, someday, would care enough to find the truth." Jasmine lowered the letter slightly, her eyes sweeping across the courtroom. Some reporters were blinking back tears. Others had lowered their cameras. The mood had shifted. No more smirks, no more snide remarks. The words weren't coming from a politician anymore. They were coming from a mother who had lost everything. And in that moment, Lena Watkins became real to everyone in that room. Not a statistic, not a headline. A woman whose silence had been forced, whose grief had been dismissed. Jasmine stepped forward then, her voice firmer now but still lined with sorrow. "Lena gave me this letter the last time I saw her alive. She died last spring. Heart failure, they said, but I think it was something worse. I think it was a weight of not knowing what really happened to her boy." She placed the letter gently on the bench before the judge, not as evidence but as a wound laid bare. The courtroom remained quiet as Jasmine returned to her case and drew out another item, a printed military file, its header clearly marked top secret but now fully declassified. Parts of it had once been blacked out. Now every line was visible, every timestamp, every name. She held it up for the room to see. "This," she said clearly, "is the after-action report from Operation Hollow River, the operation that killed Private Elijah Watkins. For over a year, this document was sealed. Until last week." Justice Barrett shifted in her seat. Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't speak. Jasmine placed the file on the evidence table with calm precision. Then she pointed to the final page. "Right there, the authorizing signature. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, you approve the deployment, you approve the funding, and you authorize a private contractor who supplied faulty equipment that led to 3 confirmed soldier deaths." Gasps rippled across the courtroom. A reporter dropped his pen. One juror leaned forward, stunned. Even the bailiff blinked in disbelief. Barrett's lips parted slightly. Her jaw tightened, but her words didn't come. And then Jasmine reached for the final piece. She pulled out a printed photo, grainy but clear enough to be unmistakable. She turned it toward the court. "Taken just 8 months ago," she said. "Justice Barrett, seen having dinner in Georgetown with Miles Kenner, CEO of Strat Defense, the same contractor named in the Hollow River report." The reaction was immediate: shock, outrage, disbelief. Even silence had weight in that room, and now it pressed against the walls like thunder. "No one's smiling now," Jasmine said, her voice low and steady, "because what began as a trial against me has just become a trial of something much deeper, what we allowed to stay hidden, and who we let pay the price. She stepped back from the evidence table and looked not at Barrett but at the audience. She was no longer defending herself. She was exposing a system. One where mothers like Lena were left with folded flags and no answers. One where names on paper mattered more than lives lost in the field. One where the truth wasn't lost. It was buried. And now, for the first time in that courtroom, the truth had a voice. Just as the courtroom began to absorb the weight of Jasmine's revelations, a quiet sound broke the silence. The heavy double doors at the back creaked open. Heads turned instinctively, and for a moment, no one moved. Framed in the doorway stood a petite elderly woman, her silver-gray hair pulled into a tight bun, her back slightly hunched, her step unsteady but purposeful. She wore a bright red coat that clashed with the solemnity of the room, but on her, it didn't feel inappropriate. It felt like a statement. One hand clutched a worn cane. The other held a folded photograph pressed tightly against her chest. A hush fell over the gallery. Even the judge paused, as if sensing that something sacred had just entered. The bailiff instinctively stepped forward to assist, but she waved him off gently. Step by step, she made her way down the aisle, her cane tapping softly against the polished floor. Jasmine turned the moment she heard the sound, and for the first time since the hearing began, her composure wavered. This wasn't a witness summoned by subpoena. This wasn't part of any legal strategy. This was Eleanor Watkins, the mother of Lena, the grandmother of Elijah, and her presence alone shifted the atmosphere from legal proceedings to something far more personal. A few jurors looked away, visibly emotional. Even some of the reporters lowered their pens. The tension that had once filled the room was now replaced by something deeper, reverence. When Eleanor reached the front, Jasmine offered her a steadying hand. Eleanor took it, looked her in the eye, and gave a faint nod that said everything. "I'm ready." Jasmine stepped aside, allowing her to take the witness stand. The judge didn't object. Neither did Barrett. In fact, the courtroom was so still that the hum of the air conditioning suddenly felt like a roar. Eleanor adjusted the microphone slowly, glanced at the room, then at Barrett. She didn't read from a script. She didn't ask for permission. She simply began to speak in a voice aged by time but sharpened by loss. "My name is Eleanor Watkins," she said, each syllable steady as a heartbeat. "My grandson was Private First Class Elijah Watkins, and my daughter was Lena. She buried him, and then she buried herself." For a second, no one breathed. Eleanor's voice trembled slightly as she continued, but her words never lost their weight. "Lena was a good mother," she said. "She raised that boy on her own, put herself through nursing school, taught him to pray before bed and stand up straight when the anthem played. She never complained, never asked for help. But the day Elijah died, something inside her cracked. She reached into her coat pocket and unfolded the photo she'd clutched on her way in. Holding it up, she turned it to face the courtroom. It was Elijah, barely out of high school, grinning in his uniform beside a beat-up car with a sticker that read "Proud Army Mom." Her fingers trembled as she held it. "She called me after the funeral," Eleanor said, voice thickening. "Told me she couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. She stopped going to work, said she kept hearing him in the house, his footsteps, his laugh, his music. And every time the phone rang, she hoped it was someone calling to say it was all a mistake. But no one ever called." Then she turned to face Justice Barrett directly, and her gaze hardened. "You didn't just bury that mission, Judge Barrett. You buried my grandson, and you buried my daughter with him. You told the world he died in service, but he died because someone didn't care enough to stop a lie. Someone with power. Someone with a signature." Barrett sat motionless, her jaw clenched tight, her hands gripping the edge of the bench. Her expression, once defiant, had softened into something resembling guilt. But Eleanor wasn't finished. She drew a deep breath. Then her voice cracked, not from weakness but from the unbearable weight of truth. He was 19. He wanted to go to college. He wanted to come back and open a mechanic shop. He wrote in his last letter that he was going to surprise his mama and tell her she didn't raise a failure. Tears began to fall, not just from the family but from strangers in the courtroom. A juror wiped his face with the sleeve of his jacket. A journalist lowered her camera and covered her mouth. Even the bailiff turned his head, blinking rapidly. Jasmine stood behind Eleanor, her hands folded, her eyes wet but unwavering. She wasn't standing there as a politician. Not anymore. She was something else entirely now, a promise keeper, a truth bearer, the voice that Lena had never been allowed to raise and the shield that Elijah had never been given. And as Elena sat down, the photo still in her hand, the courtroom remained frozen, not in fear or shock this time, but in collective grief. The kind of grief that doesn't ask for permission, the kind that doesn't fade quickly, the kind that stays with a country until someone is brave enough to tell the story out loud. Jasmine had opened the door, but it was Elena who walked through it and reminded everyone that this wasn't just about law. It was about love, loss, and the devastating silence left behind when truth is traded for power. The courtroom had barely recovered from Eleanor Watkins's testimony when the next name was called. A slender woman with tired eyes and a posture shaped by years on her feet stepped into the witness box. Her name was Susan Wallace, a former Army nurse who had served at Fort Brightite Medical Center. She wore a modest blouse, her name tag from the VA hospital still clipped to her coat pocket, as if reminding herself who she had become since that night. She didn't bring notes. She didn't ask for water. But when she looked at Jasmine, something in her expression softened, like she recognized the same kind of weight in Jasmine's shoulders that she had carried for years. She adjusted the microphone gently, her hands trembling just enough to be noticeable. "I was on duty the night Private First Class Elijah Watkins was brought in," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was chaos. There had been a blast in the field. We weren't told anything beyond that. Classified, they said. No details, no questions." She paused, her lips pressing tightly together. "But I saw him. He was still breathing." The room tensed as people leaned forward. Jasmine sat at the edge of her seat, her eyes locked on Susan, not interrupting, just listening. Susan swallowed hard, then continued. "He was alive for 27 minutes. I remember that because I watched the clock the entire time. 27 minutes between the moment we pulled him off the transport and the moment his heart stopped. And in those 27 minutes, he kept asking me, over and over, did my mom know I wasn't supposed to be there? Does she know I wasn't supposed to go?" Her voice cracked. He said it like a prayer, like he thought if he said it enough, maybe someone would finally tell her. Several people in the gallery quietly wiped tears from their faces. One juror closed her eyes tightly, as if the image of a dying 19-year-old boy whispering for his mother was too much to bear. Even the defense table looked shaken. Justice Barrett shifted slightly, but her expression remained unreadable. Susan's voice had no malice, no performance. It was just a woman recounting the night she never forgot and never forgave herself for. "He didn't die instantly like the report said," Susan added. "He died knowing something was wrong, and he died not knowing whether anyone would ever speak up for him." Jasmine stood up slowly from her seat, walked toward the evidence monitor, and held up a small USB drive between her fingers. "If it pleases the court," she said, her tone calm but resonant, "I have one more piece of evidence. It's not a document. It's not a photo. It's a voice." She inserted the drive, and the courtroom's attention sharpened like a blade. The room fell completely silent as the audio file began to play. A woman's voice, crisp, authoritative, and undeniably familiar, rang out through the speakers. "If the mother pushes too hard, we'll release a statement suggesting her son violated protocol. That'll kill the story before it begins." Gasps exploded through the room like a sudden wave. Reporters froze mid-pen. Jurors looked around in disbelief. The judge leaned forward slowly, his expression unreadable but his eyes burning with realization. Barrett, seated high above them all, went pale. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then her hands subtly gripped the arms of her chair. Jasmine turned from the screen to face the court, her voice firm but void of vindication. That voice belongs to Justice Barrett, recorded during a private meeting with her aides 3 months after Elijah Watkins died. She paused. "It was given to me by a former staffer who couldn't live with what she'd heard anymore." The defense team shuffled their papers. One attorney stammered something about unauthorized evidence protocols, but his words fell flat, technical jargon in a room that had just witnessed emotional devastation. Jasmine didn't respond to him directly. She simply looked back at the audience and spoke to the people who mattered. "I didn't come here to destroy anyone," she said. "But I will not stand by while a grieving mother is painted as hysterical and her son is buried beneath redacted lies." Justice Barrett opened her mouth, but nothing came. Her eyes searched the room like someone trying to find a door that no longer existed. The mask of control she'd worn for so long was cracking, not because someone had bested her in argument, but because her own words had turned against her, unfiltered, undeniable, recorded. One reporter, visibly shaken, turned off his recorder and placed it on the bench beside him. Another stood up, quietly exited, and moments later could be seen outside, hands on her knees, trying to catch her breath. The courtroom had seen high drama before, but never like this. This wasn't scandal. This was something sacred being unearthed. A truth once buried so deep it had begun to rot everything around it. And now, exposed to daylight, it refused to be silenced again. And for the first time, Justice Barrett wasn't sitting above the law. She was sitting beneath the weight of it. The courtroom was still reeling from the voice recording when Jasmine stepped to the side of the witness stand, gently motioning to the bailiff. A few seconds later, the double doors opened again, not to admit a person this time, but to bring in something far simpler, a wooden chair, worn smooth along the edges, the finish faded, the legs slightly uneven. The kind of chair you might find in any old American kitchen, pushed up against the table for Sunday breakfast or left out in the evening for a late-night talk with someone you loved. Jasmine took the chair in her hands, carried it slowly across the courtroom, and placed it beside the witness box. The room watched in silence, unsure what this meant. It wasn't part of the evidence. It wasn't in any official exhibit, but the way she moved, the gentleness, the reverence, made it clear that this wasn't just a prop. It was something sacred. This, she said, turning toward the judge and jury, was Elijah Watkins' kitchen chair. She paused, placing her hand lightly on the top rail. His grandmother gave it to me the day she buried her daughter. She told me it had always been his seat, breakfast, homework, birthdays. When he left for basic training, he asked her not to let anyone else sit in it. He said he'd be back for it. Jasmine's voice wavered just for a moment, then steadied, but he never got the chance to sit in it again. A soft sniffle rose from the gallery. A boy seated in the front row, maybe 9 or 10 years old, began to cry quietly, his face hidden in his father's jacket. His small shoulders shook with a kind of grief no child should ever have to carry. The room didn't judge him. In fact, it felt like everyone had wanted to cry for hours, but hadn't known how until that boy reminded them that pain doesn't need permission. Jasmine crouched slightly beside the chair, ran her hand over the seat. "It's just wood," she said quietly, "but today it means something. It's a seat that stayed empty because someone decided a signature was more important than the sun. And if we're brave enough to face that, maybe we can stop the next one from being empty too." As Jasmine stood back up and moved to return to her table, a small voice broke the silence. "Excuse me," it said gently. All eyes turned to the boy in the front row, the same child who had been crying. He stood up slowly, his cheeks still wet, his little hand holding something tightly. His name was Caleb. He wore a collared shirt and big dress shoes, and his eyes darted nervously between the people staring at him. His father tried to motion him back down, but Jasmine gave a soft nod, a silent signal that it was okay. Caleb took a few careful steps forward, walking up to Jasmine like he was approaching someone he'd only ever seen on TV. His small fingers uncurled, revealing a silver medal with a frayed ribbon. It was scratched, clearly handled too many times and worn smooth by little hands. He held it out with both palms, offering it to her. "My big brother, his name was James," he said, barely louder than a whisper. "He died 2 years ago. Nobody ever talked about it. They said it was too complicated." His voice caught, and Jasmine crouched to meet him at eye level. He looked at her wide-eyed. "But my mom told me if someone ever told the truth, we should give them this." A soft laugh moved through the room as Caleb fumbled with the ribbon, trying to untangle it from his fingers. "I'm not very good at this," he mumbled. A few people chuckled warmly. Even the judge allowed himself a faint, bittersweet smile. But then, as the room relaxed for just a breath, Caleb said something that made the world stop again. "My brother said if he died, someone would tell the truth." He looked at Jasmine, his lip trembling. "You did." Jasmine took the medal slowly, her hands cradling it like a piece of broken glass. For the first time since the trial began, she didn't try to hold back the tears. She let them fall right there in front of the cameras, the jury, the judge, because there was nothing political about that moment. No calculation, no strategy. Just a little boy handing over a piece of his brother to a woman who had made good on a promise no one else was brave enough to keep. The room was silent again. But this silence was different. It wasn't cold. It wasn't tense. It was sacred, a courtroom transformed, not by law or order, but by the raw and human weight of truth. By the time Jasmine stepped out of the courthouse that afternoon, the entire block was no longer just a press zone. It had become a gathering place for memory. There were no chants, no chaos, just silence. Powerful, collective silence. Thousands of people stood shoulder to shoulder behind the courthouse barriers. Veterans in uniform, hands folded over their medals. Mothers holding framed photographs of sons and daughters, some recent, some weathered with time. Children too young to understand the system clutching candles or hand-drawn signs that simply read, "Tell the truth." Jasmine didn't emerge like a victor. She walked out slowly, her posture calm but heavy, holding two things close to her chest, the letter from Lena Watkins and the small silver medal Caleb had placed in her hands. She didn't speak into microphones. She didn't raise her fist or wave. She simply looked at the crowd with soft, glassy eyes and gave a single nod, as if to say, "I see you. I carry all of you." And in return, no one shouted. No one demanded. Instead, the entire street stood still. A woman near the front, a mother with silver-streaked hair and a photo of her son pinned to her coat, began to cry quietly. Next to her, a man in his marine dress blues lowered his head and saluted. Jasmine stepped down the courthouse stairs without a word, but every step felt like a drumbeat, one that echoed not just through D.C. but across the country. News outlets scrambled to describe what was happening, but even they couldn't quite find the language. It wasn't protest. It wasn't politics. It was something harder to capture. It was a moment of reckoning. That evening, the footage went viral, not because of anything Jasmine said, but because of how many people cried watching her say nothing at all. 3 weeks later, the House chamber stood in unison, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, all rising together as a final vote was cast. The Watkins Act, named in honor of Lena and Elijah, passed unanimously. It mandated full transparency and declassification for any military mission involving the death of a U.S. service member. No more redacted pages. No more bureaucratic hiding. If a family lost a child, they would have the right to know how and why. Jasmine was present that day, sitting near the back, her fingers still tracing the corner of Lena's letter, folded neatly inside her jacket pocket. 2 days later, in a quiet corner of Arlington National Cemetery, a new memorial was unveiled. It wasn't grand, no towering statue, just a long black wall inscribed with names. Names that had been sealed in silence for years, now chiseled into stone. Flowers lined the base. Notes taped beside them read things like, "We remember now, and you mattered." Jasmine stood before the flame at the center of the memorial and reached into her coat. She pulled out a small envelope, handwritten, sealed, and creased at the corners, and gently slid it under the base of the flame. The note read, "I kept my promise." Behind her, a veteran standing nearby noticed her wiping her eyes and leaned over, nudging her gently. "That your handwriting?" he asked, squinting playfully. "Kind of crooked." Jasmine let out a soft laugh, the first in days. "I never said I was a calligrapher," she replied, shaking her head. The veteran chuckled. "Doesn't have to be perfect," he said. "You already made it unforgettable." The broadcast aired at noon, streamed live across every major network. Justice Amy Coney Barrett stood alone at the podium, not in a courtroom this time, but in a quiet chamber inside the Supreme Court building. No flags flanking her, no aide behind her, no illusions left to protect her. Her hair was pulled back tightly, her hands gripping the sides of the lectern. For the first few seconds, she said nothing. She just looked straight ahead, the silence far heavier than words. Then her voice cracked. "I thought I could live with it," she began, barely audible. "I told myself it was procedure, that the mission had its reasons, that truth was too complicated for public eyes. But I was wrong." She swallowed hard and looked down at her hands. "I watched a mother die without answers. I watched a grandmother carry grief that should have never been hers. I signed papers I shouldn't have. I protected people who didn't deserve protection, and I let silence do my speaking. Her voice broke again. I can't live with it anymore. The statement lasted just under 3 minutes, but by the time it ended, the entire country felt a shift. Amy Coney Barrett, the woman once praised as the nation's immovable pillar of legal authority, resigned that same afternoon. The news cycle exploded, but not with venom, with something more surreal, a collective pause, a slow, stunned reckoning. For some, it was justice. For others, sorrow, because her fall wasn't just scandal. It was a mirror, and behind it was a system that had long asked the wrong people to carry the heaviest burdens. Now one of its architects had finally stepped down, not by force, but by the unbearable weight of her own conscience. That evening, as the sun lowered over the rooftops of southeast Texas, Jasmine Crockett returned home. No cameras, no podium, just her daughter Avery waiting at the front steps, holding a glitter-covered sign that read, "Welcome home, Mommy. You made them listen." Jasmine froze on the walkway for a moment, blinking rapidly to keep the tears from falling too soon. Then she smiled, opened her arms, and Avery rushed into them. They stood like that for a long while, Jasmine's chin resting on her daughter's hair, the ache of everything she had carried finally easing in that one small embrace. Inside, Avery bounced with excitement, tugging Jasmine's hand toward the kitchen. "Can we bake cookies now? You promised. But this time they have to be for all the soldiers in heaven, okay? I want to make enough for every single one." Jasmine burst into laughter through the tears she could no longer hold back. "All the soldiers in heaven? That's going to be a lot of cookie dough, baby." Avery giggled, already grabbing the mixing bowl like a commander in an apron. "Then we better start now," she said seriously. As flour began to fly in the kitchen filled with the warm scent of vanilla and cinnamon, Jasmine finally allowed herself to exhale, not just from exhaustion, but from completion. This wasn't about headlines or legacy. It never had been. It was about Elijah. It was about Lena. It was about promises made by people who couldn't keep them, and then carried by someone who could. Later that night, long after Avery had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Jasmine walked out to the porch. The stars were just beginning to show. A breeze moved through the trees, and then she saw it, taped gently to the front door, held in place by an old-fashioned clothespin. It was a letter. She pulled it down, unfolding the paper slowly. It was handwritten in careful, slightly shaky script. The return name in the corner read Eleanor Watkins. Inside, it said simply, "You brought my grandson home. Thank you, Eleanor." Jasmine sat on the steps, clutching the letter to her chest. No words, no camera crews, just quiet. She closed her eyes, letting the weight lift. And as the night deepened and the wind whispered through the trees, one truth echoed louder than all the rest. They hadn't won anything. They had simply made it right. Sometimes the most powerful form of justice doesn't come from a courtroom. It comes from the courage to speak truth when silence is safer. Jasmine Crockett didn't stand up for political points. She stood up because a mother died without answers. A boy died with questions. And a system was willing to let both be forgotten. The lesson is simple but profound. When you have the power to speak for the voiceless, do it, even if your voice shakes, even if it costs you something. Because truth, when spoken with love and courage, can heal a nation. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell.